Spoilers. This video is a bit longer than the first two, since I can be a lot more concrete given how Dragon Quest 3 is a decent game, meaning I can talk about the full experience, including the negatives without coming off as hateful. Reducing what it's about to a single aspect is difficult, since this game emphasizes the individuality of each playthrough and player expression. This seeps into every other aspect, and no other mainline Dragon Quest game except arguably 10 cares so deeply about making you feel like a special little snowflake. In the remakes, this starts during character creation, where the game clearly differentiates between the in-game hero and you, the player, but asks you to roleplay as the hero regardless. Calling it character creation might be a bit much though. The hero is always the child of Ortega, the strongest warrior there ever was that fell into a volcano on his quest to beat Baramos. And the game starts on the 16th birthday, when you set out on your adventure to finish your father's quest. During character creation you can only influence the hero's gender and personality, but the game even acknowledges these little choices throughout. The first thing you do when you start the game for real is visit the king, who gives you a briefing, essentials for the adventure and a permit to conscript people. Or at least this might be what happens. You could also refuse and adventure by yourself, and you can get almost all the way through the game that way. You only need to visit the king to recruit a merchant way later on, and the game will even acknowledge that. If you afterwards continue to play without a party, you can not only beat the game that way, but it even rewards you along the way and congratulates you on beating the game that way, which blew my mind the first time I saw it. This isn't quite as good at getting players to test the boundaries of the game as Draconian quests, since you won't even know the game acknowledges a solo playthrough until you're doing it, and before then it will feel unintentional. But unlike with Draconian quests, there's not a simple end goal. In Dragon Quest 11, when you played with all Draconian quests and have a star next to them, there's nothing left, but Dragon Quest 3 makes you wonder, how much farther can you stretch the boundaries? It gives the player a sense of breaking the game in unintended ways. For example, by using cursed items to gain an advantage, like the mask that confuses you but gives you a bunch of defense. It doesn't matter which of these quirks are intended or not, but what does matter is that the game doesn't actively encourage or guide you towards them, which always leaves plausible deniability so a player can think they outsmarted the game or that they discovered a little secret, and either way they're gonna have a positive experience. I think it's clear that this way of playing was intended, but most people will recruit a full party of 4. And this is where playthroughs really become unique. Party building is incredibly deep, despite the building blocks being simple. There's basically just 3 free slots and the 7 classes that can fill them. But with vocation switching later on, personalities, randomized levels, all classes having their own merits, different equipment, and the seats, especially the 5 you give to every character when you recruit them, there's quite a bit going on. It's not really possible to find a solution to party building. There's not one optimal party, but you can always try to optimize your party a little bit more. The combat itself and the abilities your party members have available to them are still simple, even if an improvement from the last games, but planning for those simple battles ahead of time and building your party accordingly is where a lot of the enjoyment comes from. Personalities are very easy to change, which makes them not feel like a personality, but if you're the type to make a pet cannon for each character, there's value in that. Dragon Quest, like most old games, thrives with your imagination, and 3 gives you a lot more room than the last 2 games. For gameplay purposes, sexy isn't always the best, since some stats aren't equal, which I often hear the mechanic being reduced to. Warriors don't care about the wisdom growth, since no matter what the multiplier is, they get +0. Meanwhile, even a small boost to vitality or strength would give them heaps of stats. But there's usually still one personality that you stick with for the whole game or until you change class, and since you have free control over the personalities, it feels like they could be cut entirely in their current state. I haven't mentioned class changing yet, and it's quite simple. You keep all your learned spells and half your stats, then restart at level 1 in a new class. What aids the party building freedom is that there are no bosses to gate you out of making progress until you're able to change vocations. And getting there is easily possible with any party composition, given there's medicinal herbs that replace healing from a priest. Even no party at all isn't all that bad. Your choices ultimately won't lock you out of finishing the game, since reusable items are really strong in this game. There's something to replace most essentials like regular heal early on, zap or multi-heal, and some late game items even do good damage. The whole party building aspect is also what drives post-game. There's not a lot of post-game content in any current version and it's not very good, but just the act of grinding and building your party members up has a small bit of inherent value, meaning the excuse for why you're grinding isn't as important as seeing your characters grow. At this point you can even remove the hero from your party and go quadruple jester if you want. I expect the remake will expand on the post game and that basically can't go wrong. Stat caps being at 255 matters eventually, so by post game your characters do lose a bit of individuality, and there's a solved or optimal party for post game, meaning 3 to 4 max level martial artists with 255 strength, agility and stamina, and a few important spells learned. And I'm also curious how the remake will handle that, if at all, since the best solution for this problem would depend on so many more factors. Stat caps only matter for one interaction in the main game otherwise, which is the meteorite bracer that doubles your agility but doesn't boost it over 255. Most of the classes are self-explanatory, so I won't explain them. Thieves and to a lesser extent merchants, however, are an oddity. Their main abilities are to give you intel, but if you're using a guide they don't bring anything to the table and are weaker than the other classes in combat. The same goes for mages' peep or x-ray spell. The only time they are valuable contributions are when you're playing the game blind. Especially nowadays there's little reason for them to exist beyond getting an early sage. It's easier for a player to look up a map online than it is for them to play with a thief and have an in-game button that does less, and the wiki page on an item gives you more information than a merchant's appraisal ever will. Again, for a blind playthrough I can't recommend a thief enough, but the game doesn't properly convey what the class is capable of. This could just go unignored, but I'm dying to know how the remake will address this. They could add optional random elements to give the intel gathering spells new purpose, rework the classes or so much more. I think having two-way quirks for easier exploration against combat prowess is an interesting decision. Parties without a thief will have a harder time finding all the treasure in a dungeon. In a perfect world, parties without a thief would have a much harder time in dungeons. And this kind of matters because there's a lot more dungeons here. But that's due to another change. Dungeons actually have mechanics. My favorite is the one with the Mirror of Ra. Right when you enter there's a trail of treasure leading you to a room full of mimics, so you figure this out, and at the end of the next treasure trail maybe you even check for mimics with the peep spell. This leads you even farther and farther into the dungeon until you get to the bottom floor, where from a last treasure chest you can see the Mirror of Ra just out of reach, but you can tell that you're gonna have to fall down from an earlier floor, and then you're gonna run all the way back up until before the very first treasure chest there's a hole you can jump down. So if you knew about this, the dungeon would have only taken a few seconds, and if you wanted all the treasure you could have gotten it on your way back so much more efficiently. So the real trap wasn't the mimics, but it was going after the treasure at all. Or later on you have these things on the floor that tell you what direction to rotate your controller. There's one that steals your magic and one that forces you to play with only the hero. Those are all right gimmicks and almost every dungeon has something. If you do bring a thief, maybe you're gonna have a harder time against bosses though and will require more grinding. The bosses are decent. The important ones follow patterns which allow an experienced player to know exactly what's going to happen, and it prevents luck from impacting how difficult the fights are. Zoma will always use a disruptive wave on the same action, so you can optimize your buffs around it. This already makes the fight a bit interesting, but beyond that, healing abilities damage him. In the NES version, full heal does a good enough chunk to be worth using instead of attacks, for example. Barumos is another boss that follows a pattern, and there's so much going on with that fight. He passively heals, he can send party members back to the starting town, and you can just seal his magic. To me, this represents something great, giving the player an alternate win condition of sorts, a weakness to exploit. These types of bosses age way better and have much more charm than the typical immune to every status effect, weak to nothing AoE spamming boss. Random or small encounters like mimics are not quite on the same level, and I don't think they hold up to modern standards. What does hold up is the progression and exploration, and talking about it is long overdue since it's such a big part of the game. And to properly convey it, I'm going to do something that I hate from retrospectives. I'll talk you through a short section, the beginning to be exact, as it helps me illustrate my points better. Even if a player doesn't go out of their way to talk to everyone, they will still be guided. When you walk out into the overworld, you will immediately see a tower. This is similar to what Dragon Quest 1 did with the Dragon Lord's castle, except now on a much smaller scale. Even if you go the other way at first, there's a very limited area available to you. There's no other dungeons and only one more town with nothing in it except an NPC telling you to get the thief's key from the top of the tower and how you get it. And you're gonna want the key, cause no matter where you go, there are so many locked doors all around. But even if you want to do something else, there's only one more lead, which is a guy telling you about a secret in the forest south of the second town. That, however, is not a second thing to do, but a secondary entry to the same tower. So either way, you're gonna end up on top of the tower and you're gonna have the key, so you're obviously going to start opening doors. Find treasures, keep opening doors, and while doing that you will eventually find the next key item to blow up a path to the next area. But that's only the introduction. Dragon Quest 2 also had a relatively simple start but went off the rails later on. Well, the first thing you get after moving on to the next section is a map. You immediately funnel to a new kingdom, and as you go to save, you're directly given a quest. This is where Dragon Quest 3 again allows the player to make their own decisions though. The NPCs in this game give you actual information so you can make informed decisions. There's a town up north that was cursed to eternal sleep, and you just came off the dopamine kick that was plundering everything behind those thief key doors. And maybe you want to find the magic key instead of whatever the king wants from you. You can do those three things in any order you want. Similar to Dragon Quest 1 where stories were self-contained, but now you don't wander off until you find something, but NPCs tell you where you can go to experience whatever you want. NPCs overall have improved greatly. Not only are most of the hints coherent, the important ones actually stand out in some way. If you for example go west, there's this suspicious house that only serves to directly tell you where you get the magic key. And regardless of the other scenarios, after finding the key it's only natural to start using it. In the last town you visited on your journey there's tons of treasure. And if you continue looking for treasure, if you go to the second to last town, there's a door. But instead of finding more loot, there's an NPC that tells you where to go next. So only one new area was opened up by you getting the key. You're told to go there, and then there you're once again given directions. Specifically to get pepper for the king. Now in that new section you have two locations available to you. You have the town you need to go to for the king's quest and the associated dungeon. And you have the All Trades Abbey, which is the most important location for gameplay reasons. If you have a bad party for whatever reason, that means you can now reclass before ever having to fight anything stronger than a random encounter. For the pepper you need to fight a boss you could have fought for the king way earlier, so if you skip that you're gonna have to go back now. It doesn't make sense that you can't stop the kidnappers until their boss returns, and I do hope this gets resolved or explained a bit more smoothly in the remake. You do however have to fight them now, and your reward for it is the pepper and therefore a boat, which opens up even more of the map. And just like the tower at the very start or the castle after you drop to a new continent, there's something visible right away. There's a lighthouse with a guide that tells you about the world. Again, you're never without guidance in this game, especially because the landmasses are based on the real world. And this isn't just a quirky thing, this makes navigating the world really intuitive, and especially on replays it's very easy to remember where every location is, since it's just where the real life equivalent would be. And later on, the Dragon Quest 1 map has the same effect. By now, some of you probably know the Dragon Quest 1 map better than the map of the Earth, but that's besides the point. If I break it down like this, it seems heavy-handed, but I think it hits the balance decently well. Take a look at this town. There's a guy telling you to find a speaking horse, right in the same frame as the horse telling you to find an item, which is in the same frame as a guy that tells you where you find said item, and this is all you need to get the ultimate key and open up the rest of the game. But there's only one problem: the item is in a castle and you can't enter that castle because of a guard. Well, guess what? The town also sells you an item to turn invisible and sneak past the guard. I want to focus on this encounter for a bit, because it's another example of Dragon Quest 3 giving its players some agency. There are 3 methods to get past this guard. You can buy the invisibility item from one of the few stores, you can get the item as a drop from a random enemy, and high level wizards will learn a spell to turn invisible. But does this remind you of something? It's not a secret that Dragon Quest XI reimagined a lot of memorable scenarios from Dragon Quest 3. The traditional Japan-inspired village that sacrifices children to a dragon, the king that locks the hero in jail when you first meet him, and even starting the game off for real by leaving the small introduction area via a traveler's gate. I originally had a whole section about the best parts of the story and how they had a heart and soul that could be reimagined into something great, but I don't need to explain that since Dragon Quest XI already proved it for me. Dragon Quest is usually mostly about the side stories. The Archfiend is only ever an excuse to go adventuring and the focus lies on the adventure. DQ3 is notable for having an overarching narrative about stepping out of your father's shadow. Every other town has someone talking about how great Ortega was. Everything you do he had already done better. Eventually you even learn that he survived falling down the volcano in the intro sequence. That's how much of a badass he is. You hear tall tales all the way until you finally meet the guy, just one room from finishing the game, where his body finally, after years of pushing beyond his limits, gives in. He left when the hero was too young to remember, so you are practically meeting Ortega for the first time. But it still feels like you know this man. You've heard so much about him. He, however, after over a decade of fighting, doesn't recognize his own child anymore. He's not this invincible superhuman he was made out to be. He's dying, filled with regret that he was never there for his family. And that's one hell of a tearjerker. This is even more effective in the remakes, where there are even more events building up the Ortega mythos, like the town where his helmet is stored. This was a highlight scene and I can't wait to see how the HD remake is gonna polish it up even further. It really does have an impact on you and gets you fired up to take on Zoma. Zoma is not an interesting villain, but he is a fitting and effective one for the purposes of a Dragon Quest story. Zoma is not very present. He's slightly hinted at before you beat Baromos, then he appears afterwards, but that's all you hear from him until you fight. I've talked about the gameplay side already, but I adore his menacing design that is the perfect way to round off this trilogy. The last 2 games had the first phase of their final fight be a blue-skinned caster looking guy with a necklace and a robe. Zoma even has a brooch with a red gemstone outlined with gold that looks the same as the one from the Amulet Hagen and the Dragonlord War. But the curveball here is that he is actually the final boss, a sort of fusion of the designs but upgraded to something now worthy of being the climax. Unlike the first two games, there's no more twist fight afterwards. The real twist, as we know, came after Barrowmouse and again after beating the game. Discovering that the Dark World is Alfgard and becoming the hero that was referenced throughout Dragon Quest 1 and 2 is iconic. The game still works without that prior knowledge. I'd say it still functions if you stop playing after Barrowmouse, but the best experience is after playing Dragon Quest 1 first. 2 is redundant because it doesn't add to the legend, it only reiterates. Furthermore, you don't visit any locations or find any items that were exclusively in Dragon Quest 2. The Dark World is the Dragon Quest 1 map and redoes the Dragon Quest 1 storyline of making the rainbow drop and getting to the castle. I have heard people ask for a trilogy remake, but as you can probably tell from my video on Dragon Quest 2, I don't think that's ever going to be a must play. Even for a Dragon Quest fan. I believe that unless the Dragon Quest 2 remake was a reimagining, remaking Dragon Quest 1 in short as bonus content or something would be a much more elegant solution. I'm a little relieved that they chose to only remake Dragon Quest 3, since that's the only game besides Dragon Quest 9 in the series that I truly believe needed a remake, because all the others either hold up very well or hold minimal value that could be unearthed by a remake. But if I'm such a big Dragon Quest 3 stan, why would I ever want a remake? Currently the best version is on the Super Famicom. Unlike the remakes for Dragon Quest 1 and 2 on that console, Dragon Quest 3 uses the Dragon Quest 6 engine, so it looks better, has more animations, even more quality of life and sounds better. And the additions like Thieves, the introduction scene or Ortega's helmet are all good. There's no official translation, but I don't think that hinders it in the slightest. The current fan translations are leagues better than the official localizations from back in the day, since they are much closer to the original vision. Even Howie agrees. I think it can be good when the localizations don't do a one-to-one adaptation of the Japanese version, since I am not a big fan of, for example, the menus. But to me, the Old English and for example dialects in Dragon Quest 4 went way too far in distorting the original, since there are so many connotations attached. Despite what I said in the introduction video, the Super Famicom version is a game I would consider recommending to certain RPG fans. But there are still a few problems that a remake could fix and a few great moments that the remake could expand upon. So a few things I haven't already criticized about Dragon Quest 3 on the Super Famicom. The fan translations are good, but they don't utilize the source material's full potential yet. I hope the 3D remake gets a modern style localization with the type of humor and charm we as the Western audience are used to. The visuals on SNES are leagues better than the other versions, but outdated nonetheless. Some of the scenes redone in a more cinematic way could be absolutely stunning. There's also problems with 3D, which is still about visuals, but this is the thing that will certainly get fixed. Sometimes it's hard to tell where exactly a rope is, and flying on Ramia looks really bad. The entire Immigrant Town event is clunky, triggering the final state is arbitrary, and the gameplay boils down to sailing back and forth because you can't zoom to it. There's a few more zoom locations I'd enjoy. Specifically the ruined ghost town and to a lesser extent the pirates hideout, maybe Greenland and maybe the fairy village. I've heard people argue that the game doesn't give you the same feeling as the first two games because it holds your hand too much. But I disagree with that notion. The game does still have secrets. A lot of things in this game won't be experienced by most players, like the reward for defeating Barrowmouse without a party or the golden claw in the secret basement. And that's what makes those moments special. You don't need to find a secret to complete the game though, which allows them to be as hard to find as they are. So I'd argue they feel better than finding a Sun quest that everyone who finished Dragon Quest 2 found. And finally, I think the gameplay has a few quirks that could use improvements. Quite a few. Wisdom as a determining factor for learning spells doesn't function because there's a minimum level for each spell and your stat depends on your class. Just like how what spell you learn depends on your class. It only matters if you have a personality that vastly reduces your wisdom, because then you get delayed by 1 or maybe 2 levels. Some accessories are nonsensical. The stat boosts to wisdom and stamina don't do anything because those stats only affect your HP and MP. Cursed equipment getting destroyed when you remove it is also a bit of a shame, since Dragon Quest 3 put some effort into making cursed equipment that's worth the consideration. And a couple of things could be more transparent, for example how much HP Baromos or Veiled Zoma recover per turn. And I think I mentioned everything else somewhere in the flow of the video, or it's too surface level. Unlike the last two games, in Dragon Quest 3 you actually exit the shadow of Ortega eventually. You've been chasing him until you caught up and found out he was not this demigod but a man. The heroes in Dragon Quest 1 and Dragon Quest 2 never caught up. They never achieved something greater than the hero from Dragon Quest 3. Similarly, I think a remake of those two games will never catch up to Dragon Quest 3 and they stand in its massive shadow. If I rank my favorite Dragon Quest games, 2 would be the least favorite and Dragon Quest 1 would be the second to last. Maybe it would outperform a few of the spin-offs if I included those. Dragon Quest 3 on the other hand would be in my top 5 or top 10, depending on whether I include spin-offs again, which is a very high bar. And that's in its current form, the version from 1995 on an SNES emulator. Dragon Quest 3 is a game with a lot of solid ideas, but ones that could still be expanded upon. There are so many possible quality of life improvements, like enemy names changing color when they're close to death, and so many little additions that could greatly alter the experience, like even one extra class, maybe draconian quests. If there's a draconian quest for randomized treasure locations or limited reclassing, I'm gonna explode. I'm not even gonna be able to play the game, I'll just be dead. I have no idea what direction the remake is gonna take. We basically have no information on it, but I can't wait to find out. I'm optimistic the remake will be worth recommending to all RPG fans. It should be, just as long as it does a little more than the bare minimum.